The Shepnaz podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. Yesterday, we started a discussion with Pastor Nick about his message from this past Sunday, and we got into the ever-fun subject of Christians being judgmental. So if you missed that, you might want to go back and listen to that from yesterday. But there's definitely some things that we believe as Christians, and we see the world around us that doesn't match up with that. So sometimes we feel like we need to speak up. But yet the unbelieving world, and even sometimes the believing world, feels like that is our major characteristic, is that we are judgmental. So today we're going to dive back into this discussion and see if maybe there's some constructive ways that we can hold each other accountable but not come off as being judgmental.
Right.
So welcome in.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah. We're going to continue this kind of conversation, this maybe challenging self-reflection that we heard about yesterday. Just, maybe there's something to this, and we don't want to be viewed as judgmental people, but also like that we're held in that tension of, okay, so do we just never point out any, how do we navigate these things? And so that passage that we spent some time in Matthew, okay to just read the rest of it here?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go right ahead.
Well,
So we're in Matthew 7. Is this, are you going to 3 through 5?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But just remind us, going into this, when Jesus says in the first two verses, do not judge others and you will not be judged, that is used so often in ways that just is not totally understanding what Jesus is meaning by that, what he's not meaning by that. So that was kind of what we discussed yesterday of okay, what does he mean? What does this look like? What does it not look like? And so we go then continue on in these next several verses, and Jesus is showing us, right? We talked about that word krino for judged, elevating yourself in a position to be able to pronounce above others, to be able to pronounce guilt on a person's life, to have the final word. We said that that's not what we were to do at all. And then we continue on, and we see here in Matthew chapter 7, verse 3, kind of Jesus elaborating a little bit more to what he's actually meaning about that. So I'll go ahead and read it. It says, "And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, 'Let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye,' when you can't see past the log in your own? You hypocrite, first get rid of the log in your own eye, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye." Again, encouraging words. If we read this story and if we think we're the one with the speck, not the log, we're reading it wrong. We read this being challenged by Jesus of like, okay, is that me? Do I identify with that at all? And so if we don't want to judge in a way that Jesus warns us not to, right, when we're elevating ourselves, we have to do a little bit of self-reflection. And that's what he's talking about here. He says, look, you're so concerned about this speck, about this wrong, this sin in this person's eye, when you don't even realize you got this big 2x4 hanging out of your own.
Right.
That needs addressed, right? And see, I think when we had the conversation about, why does the world view us this way? I think that's part of it, is because we're so concerned about people's specks, but not about our own logs.
Yeah. Well, and I think also kind of going along with that analogy is that the person that we're talking to that has the speck in their eye can see the log in our eye. And so this is where I think where the world is, sometimes rightfully calls us hypocrites, because we're living a life that doesn't match with what we say it should be, and then we're trying to call them into account for the same thing.
Yep. That's exactly right. I mean, that's what he means by judging. When you're speaking to someone in a position above them, in a place of perfection, they're saying, you are not perfect.
Right.
What are you doing there, you hypocrite? And that word hypocrite is interesting. It'd be good sometime to go even more into in depth about that, about what it means. But it basically means to perform, to put on, to pretend in a way, pretend to be something you're not. You're you're perhaps doing the right things, but for the wrong reason. Your internal is not matching the external.
Right.
And that's what Jesus calls out, you hypocrite. You might be doing these right things, pointing out, but you have this log, this internal thing that you need to deal with. And I think that's why the world, that percentage of people that were polled is so high about Christians being seen as judgmental, is we think we are being loving by pointing out someone's speck. But I threw this out in the message, but could it just be that what we think is loving is really just an external act of self-righteousness?
Yeah.
Because we're not dealing with the log, the plank in our eye.
Well, and I think that it's a situation where when we are judgmental of somebody like that, and they see things in our life that are very obvious, and we're not holding ourselves into account for those things, then it creates those. We've all seen on the internet those cringy videos of people that are representing themselves as believers or whatever, and you see it and you're like, please don't. Just
do us
please
all a
don't.
favor.
Please don't say this.
Please don't do this to the church. Yeah.
Because you're making us.
We're not all like that. Yeah.
Right? You're making us all look bad. And like you understand what they're trying to say. But the way in which they're going about it, like, there's no way this is ever going to work.
Yeah.
Because you're going to, and I think maybe sometimes, and I don't know, you can tell me what you think of this, but maybe sometimes our judgmentalism is a shortcut, because I feel like love takes a lot longer than
absolutely.
Judgment.
Absolutely.
I can just drop what I think is a truth bomb and walk away.
Feel like you did your godly duty, and
instead of having to do the work and invest in someone's life to actually show them love. I think that's something that we have to take inventory of. Like, am I just like pretty much giving somebody a message and say, there, deal with that, and then I walk
accept
off.
it or reject it. It's up to you now.
Right. And that like takes me off the hook now. I've shown them love. I showed them tough love, and now they're just going to have to deal with it.
And then they put out surveys and see, are Christians judgmental? And then 87%, and we wonder why. What?
So does that mean then in all cases we don't say anything?
Yep, that's the like we share, the tension that we're in of. So then what, does anything go? No. I mean, it's not that Jesus saying, when Jesus says don't judge, we think, oh, anything goes. We never say anything to anyone ever. But we say the right thing to the right people at the right time in the right way. That's what Jesus, when we're talking about judging, do not judge inappropriately. Well, there's also the reality when Jesus goes into that illustration. You're so worried about the speck, but you have this plank. Well, there's also the reality that there is a speck.
Yeah.
There's a speck, and that's okay. But to focus on that and to deal with that without having first dealt with the log in your own eye is inappropriate, is wrong of us. So we asked this question, well, how does it look like, right? I shared the passage from Galatians chapter 6, the first 3 verses. I'll go ahead and read it again for us. Dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by some sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path. And be careful not to fall into the same temptation yourself. Share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important.
I love that translation.
Yeah. You are not in that position of perfection and importance, and to be able to declare over one's life guilt or innocence. So it says, if overcome by some sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path. That's what I kind of envision what Jesus is talking about. Like, there's that speck, the reality of the speck in another person's eye, that is important to work through. Like, not just to ignore it, to say, oh, it's okay, to gloss over, but to deal with it in an appropriate way is the key.
Well, and I think, at first blush, people might see the passage in Matthew and this passage in Galatians and think somehow they're in conflict. Like, one saying, don't judge, and then the other one's like, here's how to do it.
Yeah.
And when we go back to the passage that you were looking at in Matthew 7, it's like they want to stop at the end of verse 4 and not read the rest of verse 5.
Then you will be able to help.
Right. So the rest of verse 5 is, first get rid of the log in your own eye, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. So there's definitely a plan to deal with the speck in your friend's eye, but it's the first step is taking care of what's in your life. And then, so this passage in Galatians is then saying, okay, so here's how you're going to deal with the speck. And
gently and humbly.
Right.
That comes from self-reflection, personal repentance of dealing with the log first. I mean, we just cannot get away from that. If we think we're going to try to help someone else without first humbling ourselves, we're not helping at all. We're not helping at all. That's really the crux of this. What Jesus is talking about is dealing with the plank. Like, but we think sometimes as Christians, like, the specks that we see in other people are just so important that they need pointed out, they need called out. I would say, okay, but what about this? What about this log? Let's deal with that first before anything. That needs dealt with.
Well, and if we take that approach, I wonder if we're ready for the transparency that's required for that. Because maybe the way I approach my brother, where I see an issue, is by first coming to him and saying, look, I'm dealing with things too. Here's what I'm dealing with. And I recognize that this is the stuff that's going on in my life. And you know what? I'm asking you for some prayer on this. But I'm also seeing some things that maybe you haven't seen yet, but maybe you would consider looking at these things in your life. And I wonder if we could come at it with that kind of transparency, if we wouldn't come off being quite so judgmental.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you're just talking about, the kind of the longer process to love. I mean, it's a lot deeper than just, and maybe that's a larger discussion about the church as a whole in general, just maybe how the state of the church is in our culture today. Of sometimes there's lack of closeness, there's lack of accountability, there's lack of genuine discipleship, of people who are invested in each other. I mean, that takes time, that takes sacrificial love, and that's difficult, I think, because we're all busy people. We all have other things going on, but it is an act of sacrifice, vulnerability, accountability, to have those relationships, which I would argue is really the church. It's what the church is supposed to be. But we're not always good at it. but that is what's needed, really in the discipleship process. And that's what I shared about, when we are dealing with the specs, when we're trying to help, we have to understand, like, first, okay, we deal with the log, we deal with, we ask God, okay, what is it in my life that needs dealt with? And then we are able to help our friend gently and humbly. And the picture that comes to mind when I read this story about, like, speck, it's kind of this idea of sawdust. Like, a person has a piece of sawdust, and if you've ever got sawdust in your eye, I'm sure you have. What do? You kind of rub it, try to get it out. Like, what if it doesn't work? What if just rubbing it doesn't work? Well, then you, at least me, kind of just cup some water and try to flush it out. And we want to help with that, right? As Jesus says, then you will be able to help with the speck in your friend's eye. What's not helpful is blasting them with a fire hose.
Right.
I got the speck. Well, yeah, but you messed up a whole bunch of other things. Like, that's not helpful.
Yeah.
So even that, when we don't do it in a gentle and humble way with the speck, can be judgmental, and that comes out in a lot of ways, and it really just does a lot of damage instead of a lot of good.
Yeah, as you were describing that imagery, it was really coming to life to me in a way perhaps that I hadn't thought about before, especially when you're talking about kind of sawdust or whatever. Sometimes when we're trying to get it out on our own, there comes a point, because we're already feeling the consequences of that speck being in there, that even when we get it out, we're not sure. And I can think of times when I've had something in my eye, and then I might walk over to somebody else and pull my eyelid down and say, like, is it still in there, or did I get it? And, maybe in a weird way, we need to be at that point realizing that we can be there for each other, and not just to point out the specks, but say, yeah, it's gone. You might still be feeling some of the ramifications and consequences from it, but it's out. Yeah. And I can encourage you by saying, it's gone. Yeah. And to be that person that might be able to help that along. Yeah. So feel free to grab that.
That's good. Yeah.
All right. Any last thoughts for us as we wrap up today?
I'll just say we've summed up really this, I believe, in a good way, of this message, what Jesus is talking about. But let me just go back to what kind of wrapped up the message with on Sunday, that passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We have to, I think another reason why we are viewed by the world at large as judgmental people is because we do things perhaps the same as we would do for other believers, we try to then do to non-believers. That's not right. That is not right. Because what we do, I'll just read that passage from 1 Corinthians real quick. It isn't my responsibility to judge outsiders, but it certainly is your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. So we have to, when we're going about this and desiring not to do what Jesus warns us not to do, but also to keep this in a reality of helping with the specks, we have to understand that looks different between believers, mutual believers, and a believer perhaps and a non-believer. I think that's where we get a lot of confusions, is when we look, when we're interacting with non-believers and saying, hey, there's this speck in your eye, like you need, they don't care about specks or logs or anything, right? Because they are not, if they're not following God, what do they care what God has to say?
Well, plus that was never the mission. It was never the mission to make moral non-Christians.
Yes.
It was to make disciples of Christ and let the Spirit work in their life.
Very good. Very good.
But so many times I do think we're trying to do our best to make some moral non-believers.
Yeah. Like what we need to do, I think would help perhaps lower that percentage, is when we come into a person who's not a believer, a follower of Jesus, is show them Jesus.
Yeah.
Show them grace and truth. And what that looks like is, hey, there's a person, when we look around the world and see all the chaos, destruction, and the brokenness of relationships, everyone identifies with that, in that they've contributed to a degree in that, saying, but there is hope for that. There is hope for restoration. Jesus Christ can restore those broken relationships, can make things whole. We give them the gospel. We don't point out, hey, this speck in your life needs dealt.
Yeah.
We give them the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's first and foremost. And then if the person is a believer, then what we first do, self-examination, God, where's the log? Then we will be able to see and help with the speck in a gentle and humble way.
That sounds great. And as with everything in our church, you cover it with prayer. If you're seeing a speck in someone's eye, the first step might be to pray for them, and then follow the steps that Pastor Nick has outlined here. We encourage you to follow everything that's going on at the church by going to shepnaz.org. Also to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube so you can keep up with everything that's going on. We love it when you do those likes and comments. For Pastor Nick, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.